On the 7th of April 1968, Formula One lost its benchmark driver. Double world champion Jim Clark was favourite for the driver's crown when he was killed in an F2 race at Hockenheim. The quiet Scot left a lasting legacy. His 25 World Championship victories from 72 starts, still enough for 9th on the all-time wins list. Clark was also successful in IndyCar, sports cars and touring cars, so selecting his greatest races was always going to be tough. But here's Jim Clark's 10 greatest drives. Number 10, the 1961 South African GP, East London. Sterling Moss was the undisputed world's best in 1961, but Clark's performances at the end of the season showed that things were changing. Clark's Lotus 21 had beaten the older 1821 model of Moss in the Natal Grand Prix earlier in the month, but the East London race stepped things up a notch. Poleman Clark and teammate Trevor Taylor led away, but Moss was soon into second and took the lead when Clark spun, avoiding another car. Clark charged, despite damage to the gearbox, lapping faster than his pole time, and Moss was powerless to stop him coming through to the win. Number 9, the 1968 Australian GP, Sandown Park. Clark demonstrated an ability to withstand intense pressure from a potentially faster car. It was a round of the Tasman Series, essentially a Winter World Championship in Australia and New Zealand. Clark had given the newly branded Gold Leaf Team Lotus a victory on its debut at the Lady Wigram Trophy the month before, but arrived leading Ferrari's Chris Amon by just 3 points in the standings. Running the same DFW engine, the 2.5-litre version of the Cosworth DFV he'd already used in 5 Tasman races, Clark qualified third behind Jack Brabham and Amon. It was a small field, but just 0.6 seconds covered the top 5 around the 1.9-mile circuit. Crucially, Clark grabbed the lead at the start and immediately had to start defending from Amon. Brabham briefly joined them before retiring, but the pressure on Clark remained. Clark did open some breathing space, but Amon closed in towards the end, setting up a grandstand finish, and they crossed the line as one. The official winning margin was 0.1 seconds. Not only had Clark withstood enormous pressure for over an hour, the result all but secured him his third Tasman crown. Number 8, the 1963 French GP in Reims. Clark still has more Grand Slams, win, pole, fastest lap and led every lap, than any other driver in World Championship history. The 1963 French GP was his third, but that level of domination hit a challenging event for the Scot. As was the norm that season, Clark's Lotus 25 took pole comfortably and pulled away from the field in the early stages. He led by 3 seconds after lap 1, but on lap 14, his Coventry Climax engine began to miss fire. A brief shower allowed Clark to increase his lead before his tyres, now in their 4th race, started to struggle to clear the water. Jack Brabham closed in, but an ignition lead fell off and delayed him. 2 broken valve springs were later found to be the cause of Clark's engine problem, but he'd still taken victory by over a minute. Number 7, 1963 Aintree 200. This non-championship event was the scene of one of Clark's great comeback drives, after his pole-sitting, fuel-injected Lotus 25 suffered battery failure at the start. Clark eventually got going, but the car wasn't right, so he took over teammate Trevor Taylor's 5th-placed sister 25. That was running on carburetors, not the fuel injection that Clark used for much of 1963. Taylor had qualified 6th and took over Clark's fuel-injected Climax-engined machine to finish 7th, but his team leader was on a mission. Clark rejoined 1 minute and 38 seconds behind the leader, Graham Hill. But he charged to 3rd, finishing 28.6 seconds behind the victorious BRM driver. He also left the lap record 3.2 seconds quicker than his fastest lap from the previous July's British GP, which he'd dominated. It was also an event Clark later picked out in his autobiography, saying, "I had a great race catching up the field and smashing the lap record. I really enjoyed this race, more than a number of the GP events I was to drive in during the season." Number 6, the 1965 British GP at Silverstone. One of Clark's strengths was how easy he was on the machinery, which enabled him to coax results from Lotus boss Colin Chapman's sometimes fast but fragile cars. The 1965 British GP was a fine example. Although Richie Ginther's Honda jumped ahead at the start, Clark's Lotus 33 was in front by the end of lap 1 and headed off into what looked like another decisive lead. He was 36 seconds ahead, despite a small misfire when his oil pressure started to drop. Graham Hill closed in, although he too was having some difficulties with his BRM's brakes. Clark then drove on the ignition switch, coasting through some corners to prevent oil surges ruining the bearings, while holding Hill at arm's length. Clark held on to win by 3.2 seconds, despite a lap record from Hill on the final tour. Number 5. The 1965 Indianapolis 500. Clark's stunning 1963 Indianapolis 500 debut, where he was controversially beaten when the oil-leaking roadster of Parnelli Jones was not black flag, could have made this list. But it's arguably Clark's biggest win that gets the nod. Even he describes it as perfect. Although most of the runners were now rear-engined, the Len Terry Colin Chapman penned Lotus Ford 38 was still cutting edge, and Clark always had an advantage over teammate Dan Gurney, who battled with Jones before retiring. Clark led lap 1, was overtaken by poleman AJ Foyt in a modified Lotus 34 on lap 2, and then retook control on lap 3. Thereafter, apart from the pit stops, Clark dominated the race, aided by a new and more efficient fuel injection system. Second man Jones was hobbled by a lack of fuel in the closing stages, only just staving off Mario Andretti, leaving Clark to win by almost 2 minutes. The Scot smashed the race record, becoming the first to average over 150 miles an hour for the 500, and the first Indy winner to use a rear-engine machine. The performance also earned Clark over $150,000. Number 4. The 1967 Italian GP at Monza. This is often cited as Clark's finest drive. Indeed, some have suggested it's the greatest F1 drive of all time. The basic facts are that Clark's Lotus 49 took pole and engaged in a classic slipstreaming battle with teammate Graham Hill and the Brabhams of Denny Hulme and Jack Brabham early on. On lap 13, he pitted with a puncture and resumed just over a lap behind the lead fight. Clark caught the trio and eventually made his way through, giving Hill a helpful tow along the way. Both then raced clear, and when Hill retired with 10 laps to go, Clark had victory in his sights. He overtook leader Brabham and seemed destined to take a remarkable win when the Lotus spluttered with fuel starvation in the closing miles, dropping Clark back to third. It was clearly a great drive, so why isn't it number 1? Well, firstly, the Lotus 49 was much faster than everything else once it arrived in 1967. From its debut at the Dutch GP, the Cosworth DFV engined car was on pole for every round. On raw pace, the 49 was the most dominant car of the 1960s and the 10th most dominant in the history of the World Championship. At Monza, only the Brabham Repcos could get close, and Hill's race underlines the 49's true form that weekend. Hill took control after Clark's pit stop and quickly built a big lead. Clark had already taken 10 seconds back, while Hill battled Hulme and Brabham, but thereafter the pace of the two 49s was very similar. Over the 30 laps between Hill taking the lead and his own retirement, Clark had gained just 2.2 seconds on his teammate, an average of less than 0.1 seconds per lap. Hulme, the closest challenger to Lotus that day, was already out, so when Hill dropped out, Clark was soon in position to take the lead. Clark himself didn't believe the drive was his best either. In Jim Clark Portrait of a Great Driver by Graham Gould, journalist Gerard Crombach, who was a close friend of Clark's, even suggested that the Scot was irritated the race was held in such high regard. The 1967 Italian GP certainly stands as testament to Clark's determination, but this race at Monza, a circuit on which it's hard for drivers to make a difference, says more about the way the Lotus 49 moved F1's goalposts than it does about Clark's exceptional ability. Number 3. The 1966 Dutch GP at Zandvoort. Well, thanks to Lotus boss Colin Chapman, Clark didn't often get the chance to demonstrate his ability to lift inferior machinery up the field in F1, but the switch to 3-litre regulations left Lotus in a bit of trouble when it came to engines. Clark spent 1966 battling with 2-litre Climax or unreliable BRM H16 power. His win in the United States GP with the BRM-engined Lotus 43 is well known, but it did require some misfortune of others. The Dutch GP was different. Clark's Lotus 33 took the fight to the more powerful Brabham Repco of Jack Brabham. After qualifying third, Clark battled the soon-to-be triple world champion. Brabham couldn't shake off the Lotus despite his engine being 1000 cc's bigger than Clark's. Clark grabbed the lead at Tarzan on lap 27 of 90 and even started to edge away. At one stage the Lotus was 10 seconds ahead, but the Brabham closed in again, going into the final third of the race. On lap 76, Brabham took the lead as Clark pitted with steam pouring from the radiator. A crankshaft vibration damper had broken and fouled a water line. Water was added and Clark still finished third, but hopes of a grandstand finish had gone. Number 2, the 1963 Belgian GP at Spa. Clark was one of the all-time rain masters, and this was one of F1's greatest wet weather performances. Following several fatalities on his early visits to Spa, Clark didn't like the fast 8.8-mile circuit, but he invariably excelled there and ultimately won 4 Belgian GPs. The second came despite qualifying only 8th thanks to oversteer and gearbox problems with his Lotus 25. Initially, things went well in the race. Clark made a sensational getaway to grab the lead before Eau Rouge. Graham Hill's BRM initially stayed with Clark, but the Lotus soon started to edge away in the damp conditions. When gearbox troubles ended Hill's race just after half distance of the 32-lapper, Clark's lead became a minute and a half. On lap 24 of 32, the Belgian GP became a fully wet race when the heavens opened, complete with lightning. Lap times went from 4 minutes to more than 6 minutes, and Clark's lead grew yet further. Conditions were so bad that Colin Chapman and BRM's Tony Rudd called for the race to be stopped. Their request was refused. At one stage, Clark lapped the second-placed Bruce McLaren, but the Cooper got back ahead so that the Lotus's winning margin was only 4 minutes and 54 seconds. And that was despite having to hold the gear lever in place and drive one-handed for much of the race on one of the most challenging tracks in the world. Number 1. The 1962 German GP, Nürburgring. Clark didn't even finish on the podium in the race that takes the top spot, but it did take place on the world's greatest circuit. The 14.2-mile Nürburgring was one of Clark's favourites, and the drive he singled out as his best began with a mistake there. He qualified on the front row behind Dan Gurney's Porsche and the BRM of Graham Hill, but forgot to switch his fuel pumps on at the start and was swamped. In tricky wet conditions, he began a fight back in which he pushed his own limits. Clark battled back to 4th and got to within 14 seconds of leader Hill, putting in one of his best drives in a battle with Gurney and John Surtees before backing off, and the Lotus started suffering from fuel feed trouble anyway. He eventually finished 42.1 seconds behind Hill, but in Graham Gould's book, Jim Clark: Portrait of a Great Driver, Gerard Krombach said, "In Jimmy's mind, the best race he ever did was the 1962 German GP. This was probably the only race when he drove at 10 tenths throughout. And that is good enough for us."